I'm very excited to be here today, kicking off the Think Tank Lab with all of you who are here with us and who are behind the screen sharing with us at this event. My name is Roderick. I'm the MERICS project lead for the Think Tank Lab, and I have the pleasure to moderate today's panel discussion. We have a stellar lineup of experts from the world of policymaking, journalism, and funding organizations, all key stakeholders to think tanks. And we want to know from them, what do they actually expect from us? What do they think we're doing good? And where do they think we actually need to improve the work that we do? And so let me just start briefly with an introduction of our panelists. With us today, we have Hannah Neumann, a member of the European Parliament, Christiane Hoffmann, a very well-known author and journalist with Der Spiegel. We have Ricardo Borges de Castro, an associate director with the European Policy Center and former advisor to the European Commission Presidents Barroso and Juncker, as well as Michael Schwarz, executive director of the Mercator Stiftung, one of our funders alongside the Robert Bosch Stiftung. And last but not least, we will also have Henry Alt-Haaker, senior vice president at the Robert Bosch Stiftung, who will wrap up our discussion and give us his main takeaways from the panel. So without much further ado, let's get straight into our discussion. And let me start maybe with the policymaker. Hannah, as a politician, what role do you see for think tanks in your work? I mean, are think tanks a must-have in your work, or are they just a nice-to-have, or if they didn't exist, it wouldn't even bother you?
Well, thanks, Roderick, first of all, for the introduction. And right now, I'm a politician, but most of you know that I have actually been walking back and forth between think tanks and politics for a while. So maybe I have a bit of a, let's say, more in-depth perspective on the two issues. Because I was aware that you're going to ask me that question, I tried to structure my input on two aspects. The first one is, what kind of content are we looking for with think tanks? Because they are a must-have, at least in the way how I do politics. And then how do we like to have this content, or how is it best basically to deal with us as politicians if you want to have an impact and access as think tankers? Because aside of the impact, or before the impact, there's actually the access issue. And I would like to pick up something that Catherine said very much in the beginning, because think tanks want to have a leverage of influence. And for us as politicians, it's pretty much the same. I want to know, as a foreign policy maker, if I look at a certain conflict, if I look at a certain actor, if I look at a certain setting, what kind of influence do we with our politics? Because in foreign policy, it's not like domestic policy where you just make the policy and then you implement it and then you evaluate it. You are in foreign policy one of many actors. So for me, the first thing I want to know, be it with Syria or be it on Putin, what leverage of influence could I, as the European Union or as the German government or as the United Nations, depending on where I am a politician, can I actually have? And that's an answer that think tanks, I think, are in a very good position and often help me to give and to understand. Then the second thing is, when I know where the leverage could be that we could have as a certain institution or organization, what are the policy options? What are the different options on which we can decide? I know there are some think tanks that are very outspoken in like, this is the way you should handle this issue. Me personally, because I still think I'm the better politician, I would rather like to know what is the range of options that the European Union, for example, could have in a certain area. And then I could, based on, well, my political understanding, pick. So that's the kind of advice I like best. And I have to admit, especially for those of us who are opposition politicians, so who cannot rely on the vast intelligence and the vast information that is available in ministries, to which, if we are opposition politicians, we rarely have access. Think tanks are a very, very important source of information. So also, if your question is on whom do you best focus, I think especially opposition politicians are very thankful for any information they get. On the how, well, when do I seek advice from think tanks? if something happens, like now the Libya conference, 2 days in advance, usually I need to have a position because journalists come asking me, what is your position? Or I think I should do a press release before that because I deal with Libya. So I have a general knowledge of Libya, but shit, what happened in the last 2 months? That's exactly when I turn to think tankers. And if you have a paper ready, because you not think of that 2 days in advance, because you think of that, let's say, a month or at least 2 weeks in advance, and you have a paper ready, that's when I look into it. Then there's the issue of network. If I work longer in Libya, like I do now, I know whom to call. If I want to have some, let's say, informal information, if I want to have a sparring partner, if I want to have like a safe space where I can also explore options, say, well, I would think of that if I work on a region longer. I would have my own ideas. And then I want to have a feedback from some expert telling me, okay, I think that's stupid because, or that's actually an interesting thought, but someone who has more in-depth knowledge, because we as politicians have to deal with so many topics at once. It's just impossible. The benchmark I would like to have for me, and that I had for me as a think tanker, of knowledge on a topic before I talk about it, it's impossible to do that when you are a politician. And I really think we should get rid of the illusion. And that's why if you are a good politician, I think that's when you turn to think tankers or other experts who you credit for having this knowledge. Aside of the papers, like you producing papers, and I especially love the executive summaries, and don't expect us, aside of like very specific issues. So you can have an executive summary, and then you would have like one part, what the EU could do. Then I would skip to that one and also read that one, but basically that's it. I know think tanks are lately, and I'm a modern politician, so I should like that, but I don't, into these like graphics and that move. And if you have bars and I want to have a paper that I have somewhere and that I can just read, and then I put it aside. I know it may be good for other audience to have all this fancy animated stuff, but we rarely make use of that, I have to admit. Aside of that, I think providing safe spaces for discussions beyond the paper is something highly valued. We may not always be able to make the time, but it's something we highly value, because when we discuss, for example, in committees, or when we are in panel discussion, public ones like this is not where we also can explore ideas and options. And maybe just a last bit, heavily rely on our staffers. They are really the ones that feed information into us. So even if you find it hard to have direct access to members of parliament, if you know the staff person in charge of the issue, that's very valuable, maybe even more valuable than us. Roderick, was that helpful?
Yeah, absolutely. Lots to take away. You know, the how, even the when. I thought it was really interesting to find out. You know, we are working for a long time on papers, and you need them though on short notice. When you see, I got a conference coming up as well. So a lot of points to think about. Let me move on and bring in Miss Hoffmann from Der Spiegel, our journalist, because I see there might be also a little bit of a clash between think tanks and journalism, right? I mean, think tanks do analysis work, journalists do analysis work. How do you see the role of think tanks there? Are they competitors? Are they partners?
I do think they are partners, but I'd like to give sort of an anecdotal answer. As some of you might know, last year, together with Christoph Bertram, who used to be the head of SWP, the major German think tank, we did a study for Mercator and Bosch about the landscape of foreign policy think tanks in Germany. And for that, we did a series of interviews also with politicians. And what was really astonishing to me was that some of those more high-ranking politicians said that they actually preferred to talk to journalists rather than to think tankers. And they gave two reasons. One is that they said that journalists usually have more special knowledge that is unknown to them, whereas most of the knowledge that think tankers can provide, they can get from somewhere else. But journalists who work investigative and who have access to people in power can usually provide more interesting information to them. And the second point was that they said journalists were better in understanding the mechanisms of power and the necessities of politics, whereas think tankers were too far from politics to actually understand the forces that were working there. And so they were very frequently giving advice that was just unrealistic, that couldn't be implemented. And I'm not telling this because it's sort of flattering to a journalist to hear that, but because I think we can ask ourselves, what can think tanks learn from this? And this is one of the points I think that Hannah has made, is that, the timely providing of information, to look. I find that think tanks very often look for sort of a broad and common kind of information rather than special and the information that politicians need who are in the executive, who have to make quick discussions, who have very tight timetables. So I think, I think to become a bit more journalistic in some way could be helpful to think tanks, actually.
I think this is a really interesting point, if I can get straight into there, Christiane, because you were saying think tanks need to become more journalistic in the sense that they need to understand power and politics better. And maybe let me use that opportunity also, because Hannah said a lot of the times it's maybe better to not get in touch with the politician, but get in touch with some of the people behind the scenes. And so there, I would just actually bring in Ricardo, who is one of those guys behind the scenes. I mean, Ricardo, you've been there in the machine room of political power at the European Commission, working for Presidents Barroso and Presidents Juncker. Would you agree with that? Are think tanks, is there a lack of understanding when it comes to political power? What was the good, the bad, and the ugly that you saw with think tank work?
Well, thanks very much, Roderick, and I'm delighted also to join everyone in this conversation, and congratulations on the launching of the Think Tank Lab. I find very interesting what both Anna and Christiane have said. I mean, probably, I would lump the ugly and the bad together, and then I'll focus on the good, if you allow me. But I would say that the ugly really, and from my personal experience, was really, the lack of time, the information overload, and the frantic pace of things at that level. There's very little time to be able to consume, quantities of information, and also because there's huge competition. I mean, not only from journalists, because when you get to the office in the morning, you have the newspapers, you have a big book of press clippings and all of these things. Then you have the newsletters in your email, and then you start, getting called for, for meetings, for this, for that. So, the attention span is very limited. And if at my level, it's very limited now, imagine what it is for a president of an institution, or for a prime minister, or for someone that is in the executive office. So I'll say that, the ugly is really the time and the ability to be able to consume that information. I would say the bad is that I would have wished to have much more time to engage with think tankers and with this type of thing than I had the opportunity to. Also because, and this is, I would sort of start making my transition as a consumer of this information to sort of a hybrid format when I joined the Commission's think tank, where I was sort of a producer of information, but also a consumer of information. But what I'm trying to say, when you are at the president's office, there is a mediation element, which is this think tank of the Commission. I'm now giving a concrete example where the interaction between think tankers and the Commission is normally done by that office. Doesn't mean that you individually cannot do that, but there's a lot of information that is filtered through that mechanism. And now, let's go to the good. The good is that, for example, President Barroso, for the State of the Union, in the process of preparing the State of the Union speech, there will always be interaction with think tankers, sessions to discuss ideas, to flesh out things. Also because, he himself enjoyed that type of activity, even if he regretted that it couldn't do as much as probably he would like. So there was clearly engagement with think tanks, to sort of to flesh out ideas, to see, where things were going. Also to see, he would test some ideas, is this being receptive or not? And then from the think tank perspective, where we relied, of course, as a think tank of the Commission, we relied a lot on the collaboration with other think tanks in Brussels and beyond Brussels, also with experts, with academics. And there sometimes, even from a strategic point of view, because we were nevertheless an internal think tank, so still within certain constraints that an independent think tank, so to say, would not have. And so many times we would collaborate with the external think tanks so that they would allow us as an internal think tank to push our agenda strategically, because they could probably introduce those topics into the conversation within the institution much, in a more strategic way, even if we had a sort of a pretty ample mandate from President Juncker to this. If now I can add a point to your ugly, the ugly, the bad, and the good is that the very good is that now my life is a think tank. So I now have the opportunity to try to address some of the issues that both Anna and Christiane were mentioning. And I would finish with this. I think timing, ideas, and communication are fundamental in this. And so it's the way that you first, are you there when the information is needed, as was already said? Do you have the right information? Meaning, are you actually thinking of actionable and operationable alternatives? Because that's what politicians always think. They always think of alternatives. If it's not this one, what can substitute this that is as effective as this thing that I can't do? So this is a little bit that, and then it's the communication. How do you convey that information?
Timing, ideas, communication, and we will get back to some of these points in our panel discussion, our debate. But let me come back now and get into the funding side of things. I mean, we talked about the political side of things, the journalism side of things that might also be better understanding political power. What's it like from a foundation perspective, Michael Schwarz? I mean, are you getting enough bang for your buck? You've, financed a lot of think tanks. You're investing in a lot of think tank projects. What are you actually trying to promote with this? And do you think think tanks are fitting that bill?
Yeah, thanks for this question. But before I answer it, let me just say how happy I am that we have the launch event of the Think Tank Lab, because I think it's a great example of collaboration, of community building, of joint learning. And it's part of an endeavor of our foundation to reflect and adapt our funding strategy when it comes to think tanks. So extremely happy, thankful to all the partners involved. Now to your question, when I heard the question, I was thinking about our founding family, the family that created the foundation. What would they answer if they get the question, are you happy with the way the foundation acts? Are you getting enough bang for your buck when it comes to the foundation? And I think they would answer, yeah, generally yes, but. And I think I look exactly, that would be my answer when it comes to my view on think tank funding. Generally, yes, we are happy with our partners. We see a lot of effort, smart people, organizations to try to adapt to new situations, a more collaborative approach to things. So of course we see impact in particular debates. So generally, yes. But are we happy with the state of affairs? Are we happy with the state of affairs when it comes to climate change, to democracy, to European integration, to migration policies? And I think we would all agree to say, no, we are not happy. And there's some reason to be even rather pessimistic. And so this is quite, I think, a motivation for us to become better in what we're doing. And so generally quite happy, yes. But I think the times that we witness now, and the size of the problems, the complexity of the problems, should really be a motivation for us to become even better.
Thank you so much. I mean, we're already running out of time, so to speak. We got around 8 minutes left for a panel debate. I think there was so much food for thought. Let me maybe bring in Christiane Hoffmann on this side again, because I think it's really interesting also what Ricardo mentioned, and it's a little bit also what Hannah Neumann mentioned, the question of communication. How should think tanks communicate? I mean, journalists have short pieces. Should think tanks try to be more innovative, work more with infographics, different digital designs? What means and tools? How can we best communicate this? What's your view there, Christiane?
Thank you very much for that very important question. And yes, they should do all of that, but all of what you suggested. But what I think lacks sometimes is that with every piece of communication that you do, whether it is a podcast, whether it is a paper, a long paper, a short paper, whatever, an interview, think tanks should ask themselves more thoroughly, who am I addressing this at? Because I see a lot of think tanks products where I ask myself exactly who is the addressee of this paper or of this, let's say podcast or whatever. And here I think, and it may sound a bit contradictory to what I've said before, but what I've said before was actually focused on access to decision makers. But if you focus on communication, then think tanks shouldn't imitate journalism. And I find that there are quite some think tanks projects that give no additional information to what I can read in any newspaper, any serious newspaper. So this is, I think, superfluous. This is what think tanks don't need to do. They have to provide more specialized, more scientific, more whatever information or different information. And as a journalist, as also a consumer of think tanks, I do appreciate very much if think tanks do informations like surveys or polls or so. And they are not always very good at bringing them into the information market. So they should focus more, maybe give them to one media as an exclusive news so they can make it bigger and not just distribute them anywhere and hope that somewhere they pop up. So, and then, what we as media need is interview partners also from think tanks. And here we need either very good specialists or people who are willing to make a sharp statement. Often think tankers are just very, very moderate, and you may regret that, but this isn't the way that the publicity market works.
That's a very interesting point, right? With the attention.
Make one last wish, if I may, because I think Hannah has mentioned this already, and I think it's extremely important. With this very much changing world and all the question marks that we all have, journalists, think tankers, politicians, doubts, uncertainties, we need to discuss more, and we need to have more room for really sort of private and a discussion that is where people can trust each other, and it has to encompass politics, journalism, think tanks, maybe economy, and so on. So I see that sometimes think tanks are doing this. They are creating these formats, and they're great. I even see politicians creating these formats because they want to exchange their ideas. So there's a great need for safe space for really open discussion.
Let me also, thank you. Let me also take some questions from the chat here. One of the questions that we actually have was also addressed to you, Hannah. The question was, how do you deal with policy papers that don't necessarily fit your policy position? I mean, do you just throw them out of hand, or do you then actually challenge yourself and ask, okay, does this make sense to me? Do you try to adapt? That was one of the questions that came out. The other question was, well, what kind of policy papers would you actually read? I mean, how long? You said, do you just go to the end and look at the recommendations? What do you say to that?
The first one, if I get one, I don't share the position. These are the ones I love most. That may be because of my scientific background. I don't know, but I don't don't need to spend my time reading a paper that just tells me I'm right. I need to read a paper that challenges what I think or says there are other options. Me personally, I prefer the papers that explore the options, as I said earlier, and then I can pick them. And that would be for me the added benefit of think tank to journalism. That really I have the options and I have them well argued and I can follow them and then make my own decisions. That's how I personally like it. I would like to pick up just quickly, sorry, Roderick, something Christiane said on the safe spaces. And here there's a very clear advice. Rather than 10 think tanks trying to do 10 discussions around largely similar topics, do one high-level one. That is really good with the key top-notch people. That's how you get us. If it's just a random one and we have 3 or 4 of them in the week, then I'm just not going to go. And then you either get the staffers or no one at all. So that's one thing Munich Security Conference is really great at, to exactly organize this one. What was the second question? Sorry, it skipped me.
Oh, it's just the length. If you could briefly say.
I don't bother the length. It has to have an executive summary, and then it needs to be clearly structured. So I can immediately go to the points that catch my interest based on the executive summary. And that will be different points for everyone. It doesn't even always need to be the recommendations, but it can be like a specific part on let's say, security sector reform in Libya. I would jump there because that's my field of expertise. Others would jump to the migration one on Libya. Others would jump on something else. Just clearly structured, a good executive summary.
Fantastic. We really are running out of time, but let me add one more question here because I think it's a very important one. It's about the safe spaces and the conversation with different stakeholders and making sure that this is not just an elite discussion as well with policymakers and think tanks. So maybe Michael Schwarz, let me bring you in here. What role do think tanks have in bringing some of this policy analysis to the wider society and not just to policymakers? Also, foundations obviously have a wider view and have a look at the bigger picture. How do you see their role there?
I think they play an essential role in translating complex situations into digestible pieces and conversations. The other day, I think probably some colleagues from ECFR are with us as well. The poll on, the Europeans' view on the world that said, I don't know, only 5% of people see Turkey as an ally, 41% as an adversary or a rival. Given the importance of this society, I mean, we need to think about how we can best explain a political position that says it is a strategic ally and it's a geostrategically extremely important country, and public opinion that has a different stance on that one. And I think reducing complexity, explaining things should be higher on the agenda. And let me say one word also to about think tank work that is very important to me now. If we see what happened to the Mercator Institute for China Studies with the sanctions by the Chinese government, or what happened to Michael Kovrig from Crisis Group, I think that shows on the one hand the relevance of think tanks and its ability to shape public opinion and what authoritarian governments see in think tanks. And I think we should really all work hard on keeping that academic freedom in our societies and shouldn't be intimidated by what happens to our colleagues. And I think that is those two examples I just mentioned are painful experiences, and we should draw the right consequences out of that.
Oh, this was really a really good point, important point to make. And I'm sorry we're already out of time, but this was really a whirlwind tour from all different stakeholders important to think tanks. Thank you so much for sharing your input with us. And I'm very happy to pass the floor over to Henry Alt-Haaker from the Robert Bosch Stiftung. What were your main takeaways? What should Robin Niblett in his keynote really have a look at?
I'm too modest to give advice to Robin on what to talk about in his keynote. But when we talked beforehand on who should take which role at this opening, I must have drawn the shortest match, because now I have 3 to 5 minutes to summarize this far too diverse and complex panel. But maybe 3 things I wanna say that I think struck me most, and then maybe 3 things that I think were missing in the discussion. The 3 things that struck me most were client orientation, comments on the substance, and comments on the format. And I think on the client orientation, what every speaker has said so far is, people have little time to read. It gets through lots of filter stages. And when a study is done is key. And I think many think tanks nowadays are still not ready yet to cater that much to their client base. in preparing their input when it is actually needed. And they're often disappointed when it's not being picked up when another agenda is high up on another point is high up on the agenda. On the substance, what I found very interesting is Hannah's comment that she doesn't want too much of a guided paper, which is contradicting slightly the study that Christiane commented earlier that we did, because there the criticism was often that think tanks don't give clear enough opinions and clear enough suggestions. But if I understand Hannah correctly, then she wants more suggestions and then pick hers that fits her agenda and her political opinion, which is I find a very relevant and important point. And Christiane's comment on, but make those options realistic. Don't dream in the kind of ivory tower of academic science, but actually, give advice that is realistic, and data, polls, statistics, kind of all those information that for an individual investigative journalist are hard to come by. And the third one on the format, I found interesting Hannah's comment on, don't put too many fancy graphics and interactive stuff online. I want a document with a clear kind of structure and executive summary. I mean, this is great to hear. So text is not dead. So thank you on that. And maybe just three things that I felt were missing, and maybe they're coming up in the discussions later. One is the exchange between those domains, because we talked a lot about how the consumer, whether it's a journalist or a politician or a think tank, and the producer foundation, or producer think tank don't actually understand each other. And maybe we need more exchanges between those domains and those sectors, more the revolving door that we have in North America. The second thing is one of the suggestions, our study that Christiane was writing was, be more controversial. Dear think tanks, don't be too polite. Don't stick too much to the mainstream. Say things that are not in the mainstream. And I think the response often is, well, yeah, but we have to cater to our funders, to our whether it's a parliament or a foundation. So we as a foundation at the Bosch Stiftung are now moving more to unrestricted institutional funding in order to give more freedom to think tanks. And the last point, over-domination of Western think tanks. The think tank market is still a very Anglo-Saxon, Western, global North market, which is no longer timely. The world is more complex than that. We cannot have people in London and Washington explaining us Africa and Asia. We need to have the global South involved in those debates. There's a lot of intellectual expertise that we're not tapping into yet. And that is something that the Bosch Stiftung is also trying to bridge. It is not easy, but it is essential. So thank you very much.